Hi everybody, welcome back. In the last several lectures, I've offered a lot to think about, a lot of difficult material, and a way to look at a familiar institution in a very different way. So I thought I'd take some time to sort of take a breath and to deal with a series of 4 frequently asked questions. That is, natural questions that arise from the analysis that I've just sketched for you, and I'll try to offer the best answers to these questions that I can. The first of the question is, what's this business about efficient crimes? What are efficient crimes? What do they look like? And why don't proportional punishments deter them? Let me offer a couple of examples of efficient crimes. One of them has to do with you driving around in your car one day, and as you're driving in the car, you notice that your appendix has started to hurt a great deal. You know a little bit about this, and you know that this is probably appendicitis. And if it is, it means you have to get yourself to a hospital, get your appendix taken care of in surgery pretty quickly, because if you don't, the appendix may burst, and that will cause all sorts of potentially very serious health problems. So you're driving in your car, and you realize that your life is now in danger because of this attack of appendicitis. So you drive to the local hospital and you want to go into the emergency room, but you need to park your car. So let's assume that you drive around just a little bit and the only parking space near the hospital that you can see is right in front of a fire hydrant, where of course it's illegal to park. And there's a meter maid who is standing near the parking meter so that you know that if you park your car there, she's going to put a ticket on the car and you're going to have to pay the ticket. Okay. How much is the ticket going to be? Well, as I've suggested, the price of the ticket, that is the criminal liability price to be attached to the criminal act of parking your car in front of the fire hydrant, is more or less the sum of all the costs that have had to be borne by everybody as a result of your parking in front of the fire hydrant. So what might those costs look like? Well, if you park in front of the fire hydrant, there's a very, very small chance that there's going to be a fire that will burn down the whole town. And if there is, and your car is parked in front of the fire hydrant, obviously the fire engines can't get to the fire hydrant and they can't put out the fire. And all of those houses will burn down, and that will produce an enormous, enormous cost on everybody. But by the same token, it is very, very unlikely. The probability that you will actually impose those costs is very small. It's very unlikely that there's going to be a fire at all. So if you park your car in front of the fire hydrant, you impose a risk, an expected cost, as it were, on all the citizens whose houses and businesses are near the hospital and might be burned down if there were a fire that couldn't be stopped because of your car. If you multiply the low probability by that very, very high consequence if the fire actually comes to pass, then the number that results from the probability times the cost of the fire is, let us say, $100. At least that's our best estimate of it. And so, according to our analysis, that's what the ticket will cost. And you know that if you park your car in front of the fire hydrant, you're going to get the ticket and you're going to have to pay the fine. What do? Well, you compare the alternatives. One of them is to park your car in front of the fire hydrant for $100 and get your appendix fixed. The other alternative is not to park your car, to save the $100 and drive around until you can find a legal parking space, but that runs the risk that your appendix will burst while you're looking for the parking space, and then you'll be in very, very serious trouble. Most people, faced with a choice of this sort, would park their car in front of the fire hydrant, and if they were asked to pay the fine at the end, they would have said, I suspect, yes, it's not pleasant to pay the $100 fine, but it was worth it. And if I had to do it all over again, I would do the same thing. I would commit the crime. I would pay the fine that represents the cost that my crimes imposed upon other people. And I do it gladly because I have so much value left over. Here's a second example of how I might do it all again. Let's raise the stakes just a little bit. Suppose I work for a boss whom I really don't like and who treats me badly. And so it occurs to me that I might get a good deal of satisfaction by punching him in the nose. But then I contemplate, if I punch him in the nose, I'm likely to have to spend 90 days in the local jail for my assault upon him. It's a crime to punch somebody in the nose. But I really dislike my boss, and it would really give me a lot of pleasure to punch him in the nose. So I do it. And sure enough, I'm caught. I'm charged with an assault, and after a proper trial, I'm sentenced to 90 days in the jail because this is the jury's best estimate of the moral cost that I've imposed by the crime itself. So there I am, sitting in jail for 90 days. As I've said, it's not fun to be in jail, but nonetheless, each day that I sit there, I think about the pleasure that I derived from punching my awful boss in the nose. Now it's the 90th day, and I walk out of the prison and I say to myself, it was not fun to spend those 90 days in the jail, but it sure was great to punch my boss in the nose. And if I had to do it all over again, I think I just might do it. That too is an efficient offense because the offender has committed the offense, imposed the moral costs of the crime, and decided it was worth paying. Notice that in this second case, there's a direct victim to the crime. So in addition to being subject to criminal liability for the assault, I'm also subject to a tort suit by the direct victim, my boss, and that too will almost certainly succeed, and I'll be required, in addition to paying 90 days in jail, to pay a monetary price to the boss to compensate him for the physical or economic costs that he's borne as a result of my punching him in the nose. It's possible that the addition of this extra monetary punishment or liability will tip the balance so that I now say to myself, it isn't worth it to punch him in the nose because the criminal liability plus the civil liability is too much, worth more to me than the satisfaction of punching him in the nose. But it might not be, and if it isn't, this is an efficient offense. It's efficient because all of the costs, economic and moral, are judged by the offender to be smaller than the satisfaction that the offender derives from committing the act, imposing the costs, and then paying the cost in the form of a liability judgment. Okay? One might object to this, that the examples are sort of artificial, they're stilted. In particular, even with my punch, they're not particularly violent crimes. Real crimes, somebody might say, are typically violent crimes, armed robberies, physical assaults, rapes, murders, that sort of thing. How can the analysis go through in those cases? How can there be an efficient armed robbery or even an efficient murder? Here, the appeal must be made to preferences. Notice that preferences, as much as prices, determine what people will do. Suppose I don't like tuna fish. I really don't like tuna fish. Then even if they were giving tuna fish away at the store, I wouldn't take any of it because I simply don't like it. If I really did like tuna fish, I might be willing to pay a great deal for it. If I got a lot of pleasure out of eating that can of tuna fish and the price were very high, I still might pay that price so as to realize the pleasure. So two people might treat that can of tuna fish quite differently. One saying, even if the price were zero, I wouldn't buy it because I don't like it. And the other saying, I really do like it and I'd buy it even if the price of it were very high. Crimes are like that. Some people would never commit crimes. That is to say, some people would never commit an armed robbery, some people would never commit a rape, some people would never commit a robbery, and they would never do these things even if the price that they would have to pay for doing them is very low. And that's because they believe this is wrong. We talked earlier about norms, and norms operate importantly in the operation of the criminal justice system. Most people simply don't have a preference to commit violent crimes. Most people simply don't get a lot of pleasure out of committing violent crimes. But some people do get a lot of pleasure out of committing violent crimes, and they're like the people who like the tuna fish. The price of violent crimes is very high, but some people get a great deal of satisfaction out of committing violent crimes. And if they do, they are candidates to commit efficient crimes because the value that they derive in terms of personal satisfaction from the crimes that they commit may well be greater than the value of the costs that their crimes impose upon other people. And similarly, prices affect different people in different ways. I said that a $10,000 fine would affect a rich person differently than it does a poor person, and I said that imprisonment is much less like that. A 5-year prison term for one person imposes a much more similar cost than to a 5-year sentence for another person than a $10,000 fine might impose in the two cases. But that's not exactly true about everybody, even with respect to prices like deprivation of liberty and living in loneliness and fear. Some people do better in prison than other people, and some people would be harmed more by a stretch in prison than other people would. The same sort of people who are not likely to commit a violent crime are people who would suffer enormously if they spent a year in prison. And not just because of the difficulties of that year, the suffering and the violence and the fear that they would experience during that year. If somebody in an ordinary life, somebody who's not a habitual criminal, somebody who doesn't live by criminal acts, were actually to spend a year in jail, that person's life prospects would be substantially diminished. It's not a good thing for a middle-class person, for an accountant or a school teacher or an attorney or a university professor to have gone to jail for having committed a crime. It's just not a good thing, and it would be terrible for us while we were there. But there are other people, indeed some of the same people who have preferences for violent crime, for whom a year stretch in a prison is not as bad as it would be for somebody whose life prospects are better. Perhaps this person is himself a violent person and therefore somebody to be feared rather than somebody who will experience fear in the prison. And many people acculturate themselves to prison life. They get accustomed to it. And for many of them, aspects of life on the outside, like gangs, are brought into the prison as well. So somebody who is in a position of leadership in a gang outside of a prison may still be in the same position of leadership inside the prison, and therefore find his conditions of confinement, as it were, somewhat less onerous than they would be under other circumstances. All of this goes to say that there are different strokes for different folks. Different people have different preferences, even with respect to the commission of crimes, and different people experience different levels of disutility from equal levels of criminal liability, from equal levels of criminal punishment. And given all of these things, given the existence of people who take pleasure in violence, and given the widespread nature of the opportunities for crime, there are efficient crimes all around us, and the criminal justice system aims to distinguish them from inefficient crimes. A second frequently asked question is suggested by our friend Jeremy Bentham, who we met earlier in the course. In his famous book, Principles of Morals and Legislation, written in 1781, Bentham considers the question of whether or not people calculate costs and benefits, whether they're rational in the sense that economists assume that people are rational. Who is there, he asks, that does not calculate? Men calculate. Some with less exactness, some with more, but all men calculate. I would not say that even a madman does not calculate. So Bentham suggests a second frequently asked question about the model of criminal liability that I've offered in the previous lectures. Are criminals rational? Do they calculate before they act? Economists assume that consumers are rational, that consumers, in fact, don't make what we usually call impulse purchases, buying goods without really thinking about whether they need them or whether they're worth the price. Sometimes we buy goods habitually, but that's because we're pretty certain that the benefits of buying the good will exceed the price of the good, so we tend not to think about it very much. But economists assume that every important decision, at least every important economic decision that people make, is based on a calculation. People look at the situation, they see what benefits will return to them from each course of action, what costs will be incurred to them by each cost of action, and they pick the cost of action that has the greatest difference between benefit and cost. This is what it means to be rational. Bentham argues that criminals are rational, and so Bentham would answer the question on the screen, are criminals just like you and me, by saying, yes, criminals are just like you and me. This is the view that has been taken by most modern economists who've studied the economics of crime, present company included. We do believe that criminals are rational. We do believe that they, in fact, think about things more often than they don't. And, indeed, we think that criminals are just like you and me. Notice, though, if you've studied sociology, that there's a school of sociological or criminological thought that was dominant in the middle part of the 20th century, which took a different view of criminals. It said that criminals were deviants, that they were ill in some way, and that they were different from people who were not criminals. This view is that criminals are a distinct group characterized by their propensity toward criminality, and that people display this propensity or they don't, and that crimes are committed overwhelmingly by those people who are in the class of people who are potential criminals, and not committed very much at all by those people who are in the class of people who are not potential criminals. The economic approach, epitomized here by Jeremy Bentham, is not so much that criminals are just like you and me, but that you and I are just like the criminals. That everybody's a potential criminal, and that everybody calculates. What distinguishes people who commit crimes from people who don't commit crimes is not that the people who commit crimes are somehow intrinsically criminals, or that they are somehow unable to control their behavior in a way that the rest of us are able to control. It's simply a judgment on the part of the criminal that the criminal act, given its price, is worth committing, and a judgment on the part of the person who is not a criminal not to commit the criminal act because the price of the crime is in fact not worth paying. Of course, in the real world, some people commit crimes without thinking about them, in much the same way that some people buy objects in a store on impulse without ever thinking about them. The archetypical crime of passion is committed by a man who unexpectedly walks into his home and finds his wife in bed with another man. He loses it, as they say. He reaches for a gun and he shoots them both dead. And when the crime has been committed and he's come back to his senses, he looks with horror at what he's done, and he explains honestly to the police that at the moment that the shooting took place, he wasn't really thinking about anything, that he was so distraught, so angry and upset by what he had seen, that his rationality simply departed. He was taken over by his baser instincts. He could not control this instinct. He could not think about the consequences of the action. He just acted in the heat of the moment, and in the heat of the moment, two people were dead. I believe that such people don't think before they act. I'm persuaded that crimes of passion are committed by people who, when they commit the crime, have done nothing like calculate the consequences and compare those consequences to the satisfaction of the act. Some crimes do have that rational quality to them. Indeed, we sometimes think of those kinds of crimes as the worst kinds of crimes because they're premeditated and people have clearly given them a lot of thought. But many crimes don't have that quality. They're crimes of passion, and we tend to be more understanding of criminals of passion than we are of criminals of calculation. Many of us can imagine ourselves in the same situation as that poor fellow who shot his wife and her lover, even if we think we might not have done the same thing that he did, and our feelings of injustice toward what he has done are ameliorated somewhat by the situation in which he finds himself. We sympathize with him a little bit more than we sympathize with a first-degree murderer. But we don't sympathize with him. We punish him. We may reduce the crime that he commits from first-degree or premeditated, thoughtful, rational, calculated murder down to a lesser offense, say voluntary manslaughter or even involuntary manslaughter, both of which don't require an intention to actually act or kill, and both of which are punished with much lower penalties than the penalty for murder. But although we may take our criminal of passion and convict him only of manslaughter, a lesser crime, rather than premeditated murder, a greater crime, we don't let him go. We punish him, and we punish him severely, and this despite the fact that we're all persuaded that the threat of punishment could not operate on him because he wasn't thinking at the moment that he committed the crime. We treat not only criminals who do calculate, but criminals who don't calculate as if they all did calculate, because in fact the law has no choice but to assume that all offenders act rationally in full knowledge of the consequences of their acts and with the decision to undertake those acts in the face of suffering the consequences of the act. Why does the law have no choice but to assume that they do this? Because any other assumption would make it impossible to justify the imposition of criminal punishment for purposes of retribution and deterrence. If somebody has committed a crime without thinking, then self-evidently that person can't be deterred by any threat that the law might place in front of him or her. If I'm not thinking at all about the consequences of my act, I can't be deterred by any of those consequences. And therefore, deterrence will not operate on irrational offenders. But by the same token, again, consider our criminal of passion. If he hadn't thought about it, if he hadn't actually calculated the consequences, if he hadn't premeditated the actual action, then he might not be responsible for what he'd done at all. Maybe it's more just or more appropriate to think of him as somehow acting in a trance without any moral responsibility for what he'd done because he'd simply blanked out. He'd stopped thinking. He'd stopped thinking of the consequences. He'd stopped thinking about what was right or what was wrong. He'd stopped thinking about the morality of his action. He'd stopped thinking about the dead bodies that might soon be lying in front of him. He wasn't thinking about anything. And so we might conclude from that, since he wasn't thinking about anything, that he didn't make the choice to commit the crime. But if he didn't make the choice to commit the crime, then it's difficult to see in what sense he is morally responsible for the consequences of the act. This would be a serious situation for the criminal law, since all someone would have to do to escape criminal punishment altogether was to say, I wasn't thinking at the moment that I committed the crime, and therefore I did not make a choice to do it, I just did it unthinkingly. In such a case, I can't be deterred, nor is retribution morally defensible. So if we're going to punish offenders, if we're going to hold them responsible criminally for their acts and punish them severely when they commit those acts, it must be because we believe that they have a choice to commit those acts or not, and that they have chosen to commit them, and that therefore they bear the responsibility for the consequences of those acts.